Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to deploy a React app to an AWS S3 bucket using Terraform as infrastructure as code. So what we're going to do is build this completely from scratch. We can see the count is working and everything, and it's all of these files are being served up from an S3 bucket, and we can see that by this URL right here, where it's the name of our S3 bucket, which is my Vite React app.s3 website, and then the AWS region, and then Amazon AWS.com. So I'm going to show you how to do all this from scratch. Here's an example of everything we're going to work on. So we're going to have 4 Terraform files, all inside a directory called IC for infrastructure as code. And then we're going to have a Vite React app, which we're just going to create really easily with Vite and just upload that to the S3 bucket. So the first thing we're going to do is just start with a completely empty directory. And next, I'm going to create a React app by using Vite. So it'll simply be this command right here. It's going to be npm create Vite at latest, which is Vite's basically creation tool. We're going to call the project Vite React, and we're going to tell Vite to use the React template starter. So I'm just going to click enter, and now we have our project right here. And once created, I'm gonna cd into this directory. I'm gonna clear out the screen, and then I'm just gonna run npm I to install all the dependencies. And now if we look inside this package.json, what we come with is a Vite build command, which we can use to build our static files that we can then deploy or upload to S3. And so to create those, all we have to do is run npm run build. And I'm getting an error right here, and it's because of my version of Node. So I'm using Node version 18, and I believe the latest needs at least version 20. So what I'm going to do is I have NVM installed. I'm just going to switch to version 22.12.0, which I think is a valid one. So check here. Yep, that's the version I'm using. So now if I run npm run build again, we've got our dist folder right here, which is what we will upload to S3 and display. So now we can get into the infrastructure part. And so I'm going to do this. I'm going to create a folder called IAC, which is short for infrastructure as code. And in this, we are going to have 4 different files, which I'll create real quick. So the first one we have is main.tf right here, which will basically contain all our main configuration stuff. We're going to have providers, which will contain our configuration. So our provider configuration, which will be AWS. Also some constraints, so version restrictions, things like that. Then in variables.tf, we're going to have our definitions. So I'm going to put something like the bucket name in there. And then outputs, we are going to have output some useful stuff that you can use in deploy scripts, things like that. For example, the name of the bucket. So we can output the bucket name to the terminal, which can come in handy in the future. So the first file we're going to work in is our providers file. And so what we want to do in here is tell Terraform which provider we're using. And of course, that's AWS in this case, and also which version of AWS to use. So the way I'm going to do that, copy and paste this code right here. So right here in this block Terraform, we're basically telling Terraform which provider or plugins that our project depends on. So AWS is an alias for the provider or the AWS provider. Source specifies the namespace and name of the provider, which is the official or HashiCorp AWS. And then version is the minimum version required for the AWS provider, which for us is going to be version 6.7.0 or higher. And just note that using version constraints helps ensure compatibility and also prevents breaking changes. But essentially this block right here ensures that anyone who clones your project and runs Terraform init, so the command Terraform init, which we will run at some point, make sure that it downloads the correct provider and also plugin version. And now let's tell Terraform how to authenticate with AWS. So we're going to do that with our block right here, provider called AWS. And in this, we're going to specify region and profile. So the AWS region is basically where your resources will be created. So say US East 1, EU West 2, things like that. And we're going to put that in a variable in our variables.tf file. The next is profile, which is basically the named AWS CLI profile to use for credentials. So this is often, for example, stored inside it'll be home directory AWS -credentials like this. This is usually where you'll find this kind of information, but I'm going to put that as a variable just in this case. But that's all we need to place in here. So next, let's start working with our S3 resources. So I'm going to go over to our main.tf file. And first thing we're going to do is let's create an S3 bucket, which is very easy with Terraform. So we're just going to use the resource AWS S3 bucket. We'll call it Vite React bucket. And the bucket name, which is what bucket does right here, will be set through a variable. And note that this is the name of the bucket, and in AWS, the name of an S3 bucket has to be globally unique. So it can't exist anywhere in the AWS ecosystem and has to be completely unique. The next thing we're going to do, I'm going to paste this in here. So we're going to configure some S3 bucket ownership controls with this resource right here. And basically what this block will do is specify how ownership of newly uploaded objects is managed. So say we upload our React app static files, who actually owns each of these files is what this does. And we specify this by using a rule and specifying object ownership. And we set it to bucket owner preferred. And this basically allows the bucket owner to automatically become the owner of any uploaded files, even if uploaded by another AWS user. So basically, whoever owns the bucket owns all the files. And basically, this is just a way to simplify things, what I'm doing for this demonstration. And now we have to do something that isn't necessarily recommended best practice, because in the real world or in production, you should, instead of just using S3 to serve things, I would recommend having CloudFront sit in front and have that serve stuff and keep your S3 bucket private. But for demonstration purposes, we are going to make our S3 bucket public, which is what this AWS S3 bucket public access block does. So what we're doing here is we're just setting a lot of stuff to false. So this basically allows public ACLs. This allows the bucket to have a public policy. This tells it to respect basically public ACLs if they're present. And this right here allows public access based on bucket policies. And if you don't know ACL, what it is it stands for Access Control List, and it's a way to control who can access your resources and what actions they can perform. And I also believe it's a little outdated compared to roles, permissions, things like that. But that's the way to make your bucket completely public is by specifying this stuff. And now the final thing we need to do, and this is arguably the most important, I mean, I guess they're all important, but this one is essentially what makes your S3 bucket act like a server serving up, or makes it a static website hosting thing, I guess you could say, is this S3 bucket website configuration. And so, of course, we're specifying our bucket again, which is the one we created at the top of the document. And this right here, index document, it specifies the file to serve when accessing the root URL. So say your bucket, say it's a website, WittCode.com, index.html is what will be served up. And of course, this for React apps, this makes sense because usually a React app is just, say, a single index.html file that then requires some JavaScript and also some styling, but it's just a single HTML file. So basically we want to serve this up as the index. And then also we do the same with error document. And so for React apps, this is basically the document that you serve up if there's an error, or if some, say for example, something isn't found. So you get a 404. And for that, we just want it to be index.html because once again, React apps are usually just a single HTML document. So, an SPA single page app. So it's a single HTML document with loads JavaScript that then changes it on the front end. So basically for every single route, we're going to be serving up our index.html file. And then finally, we're going to work with some permissions, which I'll paste below here. And this will make all files in the bucket publicly readable. And we do this with AWS S3 bucket policy. And this is the policy specified right here. And essentially what this is doing is it sets a public read policy on the bucket so anyone can fetch files via HTTP. So policy right here, what this essentially is a JSON formatted IAM policy, which allows public S3 get object access to all objects in the bucket. So S3 get object, we want to allow everyone to get an object. And the resource is basically every single path in the bucket. And then something important we need here is it depends on our public access block. And this basically, what this does right here is it ensures that the public access block settings are applied before this policy. Because if we don't do this, AWS may return a 403 error due to blocked public policies. Because remember, we set, I think it was this one right here, block public policy. So we want this to be set to false before we start spinning up this. That's all we need to work with in our main configuration file. Now let's start working with our variables and output. And so to make our Terraform configuration reusable and flexible, that's why we're going to use this variables file. And it allows us to change important values like the AWS region or S3 bucket name without modifying any core logic. So what I'm going to do is the variables we are using are region, which for me is going to be EU West 2, which is London. Profile, for me, the profile I'm going to be using is Terraform. That's just the name of the user I have for spinning up infrastructure. And then the bucket name, remember, it has to be globally unique, which I don't know if anyone's taken this name. Guess we'll find out, but that's what I'm going to call it there. But that's all we're going to do in our variables. Now let's move to our outputs. And so basically, once again, after Terraform deploys our resources, it's helpful to print out some key values like the bucket name or its public domain. And that is, of course, where we're going to be using our outputs.tf file. So what we're going to output is the bucket name, and then we're also going to output the domain. And I think there might be another way to get this domain name. If you know, just let me know in the comments. But for simplicity, I'm just going to be doing this, which is going to be the bucket name, and then it's .s3 website, region, amazonaws.com. So that's just what it will end up being, and that's how we can access our React app. So now when we run Terraform apply, all of this should be printed out to the console. And we can start doing that now, actually. So let me change into our infrastructure as code directory. And the first thing we're going to do is run Terraform init. Let me close down this so we can initialize our project with all our providers and our plugins. So we can see we're installing AWS HashiCorp version 6.12. So we've successfully initialized everything. And now what we need to do is just apply our changes. And so for this, I'm going to do Terraform apply, and then I'm going to specify auto approve. So just so we don't have to say yes, because I'm hoping everything will work. So I'm going to run this. We've got 5 to add, and all of our resources have been added, which is cool. And now we want to see, and actually I didn't save this outputs file. So let me actually run this again, just so we can get our outputs printed out. So here they are right here. Let's see what happens if I click on this link. So what we get here is a not found. So essentially our bucket is up and running. We just don't have anything uploaded to it. So this is good to know. So what we're going to do now is, of course, upload things to it. And so we have our distribution folder already created, which we can see it's right here. So what I'm going to do now is just run a simple command to push all this stuff up. And so essentially what this command does, it just syncs our generated files in this dist folder to our new S3 bucket. I'm going to do that with AWS S3 sync. And I'm also providing an environment variable file, which is my profile name, which is of course Terraform right here. And that's because I don't have that listed in my AWS credentials file. But so let's just upload that to our bucket. So it looks like we've uploaded everything to S3. So let's click on this link again. And now what do you know? This time instead we have our React app up and running, and we can see it's working too with the JavaScript. So if I click count, everything is loading from our S3 bucket. We can see that URL right here. And then finally, I just want to show you cleaning up these deployed files. So say you want to remove them after you've uploaded them. You can do them with this command here, which is AWS S3 RM, and then of course your bucket name, and then you specify recursive to, of course, delete essentially everything. So it'll delete all the files in the bucket. And so if I just click enter now, we can see we've deleted everything. So back on our S3 bucket page, if I refresh this, now we're getting not found again. So then we're back in here. And then if you want to tear down all your infrastructure, just go back to your IAC and just run Terraform destroy, and then you will tear everything down. I want to thank you for liking and subscribing. Check out my software and courses in the description. Take it easy.